What happens when a country runs out of gas and its own people start turning on each other in the streets? Right now, that question isn't hypothetical. It's happening in Russia, and the footage coming out of the country is something nobody expected to see in 2026. Before we go further, hit that like button so this video reaches more people, subscribe if you want to stay ahead of these fast-moving global stories, and share this with someone who still thinks Russia's economy is untouchable. They need to see this. For months, something strange has been building inside Russia. Cars lined up for miles, drivers sleeping in their seats overnight, fistfights breaking out at gas pumps. This isn't a rumor spreading on social media. It's a real crisis, and it's tearing at the everyday lives of ordinary Russian citizens in a way the war on the front lines never quite managed to do. For years, most Russians treated the war as something distant, something they watched on television like a foreign drama that didn't touch their own kitchen table. That distance is gone now. The war has arrived at their local gas station, and it's changing everything about daily life in the country. The root of this crisis traces back to a relentless campaign of long-range drone strikes carried out by Ukraine against Russian oil refineries and fuel depots. Since the start of 2026, these strikes have hit deep inside Russian territory, far beyond anything anyone expected Ukraine to be capable of reaching just a couple of years ago. In just the past week alone, close to 2,000 drones were tracked moving toward Moscow and its surrounding regions. 2,000, not hundreds, thousands. And each wave of attacks has chipped away further at Russia's ability to refine and distribute fuel across its own massive territory. A country so large it spans 11 time zones and stretches from European borders all the way to the Pacific coast. Think about what that actually means logistically. When a refinery near Moscow gets hit, the ripple effect doesn't stay local. It spreads outward across the entire supply chain, all the way to Siberia, all the way to the Far East, all the way down to the southern coastal regions near the Black Sea. Every region feels it, every single one. There is no corner of the country far enough away from the front lines to escape the consequences of a damaged refinery 1,000 miles away, because the entire system of production, transport, and distribution is interconnected in ways most citizens never had to think about before this year. And the people feeling it first are ordinary drivers, truckers, taxi operators, parents just trying to get their kids to school. Across Russia, gas stations have simply run dry. Not occasionally, regularly. In city after city, the same scene keeps repeating itself. Long lines of cars sitting motionless for hours, sometimes for an entire day, waiting for a fuel truck that may never show up. In one Siberian city, drivers reportedly waited behind the wheel for 36 straight hours just for a chance to fill their tank. 36 hours. That's longer than most people spend at work in an entire week, all spent sitting in a car, inching forward a few feet at a time, hoping the pump doesn't run dry before their turn finally comes. In some regions, the wait has become so unbearable that people started driving toward international borders just to buy fuel abroad. Long trips toward Kazakhstan and China, not for vacation, not for business, but simply to fill a gas tank that Russian stations couldn't fill themselves. People have started calling it fuel tourism, which sounds almost darkly funny until you realize how desperate the situation actually is behind that phrase. Families are planning cross-border trips the same way people once planned vacations, except the destination is a foreign gas station. And the goal is simply survival rather than sightseeing. In many of the hardest hit areas, local authorities have gone as far as declaring the last remaining reserves of fuel at certain stations as untouchable, reserved strictly for ambulances, fire trucks, and other emergencies. Services. That alone tells you how serious this has become. When a government has to legally protect fuel from its own citizens just to keep ambulances running, that's not an inconvenience anymore. That's a crisis with life and death consequences, sitting just beneath the surface. And desperation breeds something uglier than waiting in line. It breeds conflict. Across the country, tempers have snapped. Reports describe violent clashes breaking out between drivers, especially when someone tries to cut ahead in line after other people have already been waiting for hours. In one region, a driver who ignored warnings from others in line reportedly escalated things so badly that another person ended up hospitalized. In another town, police officers had to draw their weapons just to control a crowd that turned aggressive after a luxury car pulled straight up to the pump, bypassing dozens of people who had been waiting patiently for their turn. This isn't isolated anger. This is happening in city after city, region after region. In one location, tear gas had to be used just to break up a fight at a gas station. Clothes torn, people injured, all because of a resource that used to be taken for granted in one of the world's largest oil-producing nations. Let that sink in for a moment. Russia, one of the biggest oil exporters on the planet, and its own citizens are fighting each other over gasoline, sometimes with fists, sometimes with far more dangerous objects pulled from car trunks and glove compartments. In southern tourist regions, the tension took on an even sharper edge. Local militia patrols had to be brought in just to keep order at fuel stations during peak tourist season after fights broke out between vacationing visitors and local residents who accused tourists of draining the region's already limited fuel supply. What started as a logistics problem has now split communities apart, turning neighbor against visitor and, in many cases, neighbor against neighbor, as people who once shared the same streets now eye each other with open suspicion over who deserves the next tank of gas. Behind all of this frustration sits one question that more and more Russians are starting to ask out loud. Why is this happening, and who is responsible? For a long time, state media managed to control that narrative fairly effectively, framing every setback as temporary or externally caused. But something has shifted in recent months. Even prominent voices who have strongly supported the war effort have begun openly admitting that this fuel and energy collapse is not some accident of fate. It's the direct result of decisions and failures inside the Kremlin itself. When even the most loyal supporters start questioning leadership in public, that tells you the cracks have gone deeper than officials would like to admit. And the numbers back up what people are feeling on the ground. Independent polling groups have tracked a sharp and sudden drop in public trust toward the Kremlin and toward Vladimir Putin personally. Consumer confidence has fallen dramatically over the past year, landing at some of the most pessimistic levels recorded since the earliest, most uncertain months of the war. For years, the average Russian citizen could mentally separate their daily life from the war happening elsewhere, treating it almost like background noise on a television screen. That separation has completely collapsed. Drone strikes, empty pumps, and skyrocketing prices are no longer background noise. They are the main event of daily life for millions of people who never expected the conflict to reach their own street corner. And speaking of prices, the numbers here are brutal. Official statistics show gasoline prices climbing nearly 20% compared to last year. But that number tells only part of the story. At independent, non-state-run stations, prices have reportedly surged by more than 50% in some areas, leaving many citizens paying wildly different amounts for the same tank of gas depending purely on luck and location. When the official fuel supply can't keep up with demand, people find other ways, and that's exactly what's happening across Russia right now, whether the state approves of it or not. A black market has quietly grown around this shortage, operating through messaging apps and online marketplaces where sellers and buyers connect outside any official channel. Fuel gets sold out of car trunks, delivered like contraband, priced far above anything a gas station would legally charge. In one city, authorities reportedly dismantled an underground operation that had stockpiled several tons of fuel, selling it to desperate locals at wildly inflated prices, essentially running a private fuel empire out of a residential garage. Some citizens have even started setting up makeshift fuel stations of their own, essentially turning backyards into unofficial gas pumps. It sounds almost unbelievable, but it's a direct reflection of just how far the formal system is broken down, and how quickly ordinary people will build parallel systems when the official one fails them. And it isn't just personal vehicles feeling the squeeze. Entire industries are grinding to a halt. Taxi and transportation companies in major cities have significantly scaled back operations simply because there isn't enough fuel to keep cars on the road. Drivers are refusing longer trips out of fear they'll get stranded somewhere with an empty tank and no way to refill it. As fewer taxis operate, prices for basic transportation have nearly doubled in some cities, hitting working-class citizens the hardest, the people who can least afford to absorb a sudden jump in the cost of simply getting to work. Meanwhile, in smaller towns and industrial suburbs, garbage collection has slowed dramatically because collection trucks can't get consistent fuel. Waste has started piling up in streets, raising real concerns about public health on top of the economic strain. What began as a fuel shortage is starting to look like the early stages of a much broader breakdown in basic public services, the kind of slow institutional decay that becomes very hard to reverse once it starts. The damage stretches into agriculture too, and this part matters far beyond Russia's own borders. July and August are critical harvest months for Russian wheat, one of the most important export crops in the entire world, feeding markets across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But tractors and combine harvesters need diesel to run, and in many regions, that diesel simply isn't available. Massive harvesting equipment has been sitting idle in fields, waiting on fuel deliveries that keep getting delayed, while crops that need to be gathered on a tight seasonal window sit exposed to weather and spoilage. When one of the world's largest grain exporters can't move its own harvest, the consequences ripple outward into global food markets, not just Russian ones, potentially pushing up bread prices in countries thousands of miles away from this crisis. Freight trucks carrying goods across the country have been stranded for days in remote areas, unable to find fuel to continue their routes. Even rail transport, which typically relies on diesel-powered locomotives on non-electrified lines, has been disrupted, creating bottlenecks that are choking off raw materials to factories that depend on steady deliveries. It's a chain reaction, and every broken link makes the next one worse, slowing down an economy that was already under enormous strain from years of sanctions and war spending. Perhaps the most striking sign of just how far things have fallen is a video that circulated widely on Russian social media, showing a delivery courier using a horse instead of a vehicle to complete deliveries. It sounds almost like satire, but it's real. Demand for horses and other pack animals has reportedly spiked in some rural areas as people search for any alternative to motorized transport. And it isn't just horses. Bicycle sales have jumped over 100% in a single month, as ordinary citizens pivot toward whatever transportation doesn't require gasoline at all, turning modern Russian cities into strange scenes where bicycles and even horse carts now share the road with idle, fuel-starved cars. Delivery workers in major cities have started locking up their motorbikes and switching to cargo bikes instead. Small businesses, neighborhood bakeries, local milk and produce distributors are struggling to make even basic deliveries. And when supply chains for everyday goods start breaking down, panic buying tends to follow, with people rushing to grab whatever staple items remain on store shelves before they disappear too, creating short-term shortages that feed the overall sense of instability spreading through daily life. We're just getting into the deeper story behind why this crisis exploded the way it did, and trust me, the details ahead are even more revealing. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and drop a quick comment telling us what surprised you the most so far. It genuinely helps more people discover this video, and I read every single one. So where does all of this actually come from? The answer lies in a highly coordinated and increasingly sophisticated campaign carried out by Ukrainian forces targeting Russian oil infrastructure with long-range drones. Since the start of 2026 alone, Ukraine has reportedly carried out well over 190 strikes against Russian oil facilities, part of a broader campaign that now totals in the hundreds since the war began. These aren't random hits either. Many of these drones use advanced targeting systems that allow them to slip past Russia's dense electronic jamming defenses, something that seemed almost impossible just a couple of years ago when Russian air defense was still considered one of the most formidable in the world. The scale of the damage is staggering. All 11 of Russia's largest oil refineries have reportedly suffered significant strikes, from massive facilities deep in Siberia to major plants sitting just outside Moscow itself. Southern refineries along the Black Sea coast have also taken direct hits, forcing extended shutdowns in production that stretch on for weeks at a time. Storage and processing facilities along Russia's major river systems have caught fire repeatedly, disrupting the very backbone of how fuel gets distributed across Suchin. A tight seasonal window sit exposed to weather and spoilage. When one of the world's largest grain exporters can't move its own harvest, the consequences ripple outward into global food markets, not just Russian ones, potentially pushing up bread prices in countries thousands of miles away from this crisis. Freight trucks carrying goods across the country have been stranded for days in remote areas, unable to find fuel to continue their routes. Even rail transport, which typically relies on diesel-powered locomotives on non-electrified lines, has been disrupted, creating bottlenecks that are choking off raw materials to factories that depend on steady deliveries. It's a chain reaction, and every broken link makes the next one worse, slowing down an economy that was already under enormous strain from years of sanctions and war spending. Perhaps the most striking sign of just how far things have fallen is a video that circulated widely on Russian social media, showing a delivery courier using a horse instead of a vehicle to complete deliveries. It sounds almost like satire, but it's real. Demand for horses and other pack animals has reportedly spiked in some rural areas as people search for any alternative to motorized transport. And it isn't just horses. Bicycle sales have jumped over 100% in a single month, as ordinary citizens pivot toward whatever transportation doesn't require gasoline at all, turning modern Russian cities into strange scenes where bicycles and even horse carts now share the road with idle, fuel-starved cars. Delivery workers in major cities have started locking up their motorbikes and switching to cargo bikes instead. Small businesses, neighborhood bakeries, local milk and produce distributors are struggling to make even basic deliveries. And when supply chains for everyday goods start breaking down, panic buying tends to follow, with people rushing to grab whatever staple items remain on store shelves before they disappear too, creating short-term shortages that feed the overall sense of instability spreading through daily life. We're just getting into the deeper story behind why this crisis exploded the way it did, and trust me, the details ahead are even more revealing. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and drop a quick comment telling us what surprised you the most so far. It genuinely helps more people discover this video, and I read every single one. So where does all of this actually come from? The answer lies in a highly coordinated and increasingly sophisticated campaign carried out by Ukrainian forces, targeting Russian oil infrastructure with long-range drones. Since the start of 2026 alone, Ukraine has reportedly carried out well over 190 strikes against Russian oil facilities, part of a broader campaign that now totals in the hundreds since the war began. These aren't random hits either. Many of these drones use advanced targeting systems that allow them to slip past Russia's dense electronic jamming defenses, something that seemed almost impossible just a couple of years ago when Russian air defense was still considered one of the most formidable in the world. The scale of the damage is staggering. All 11 of Russia's largest oil refineries have reportedly suffered significant strikes, from massive facilities deep in Siberia to major plants sitting just outside Moscow itself. Southern refineries along the Black Sea coast have also taken direct hits, forcing extended shutdowns in production that stretch on for weeks at a time. Storage and processing. Facilities along Russia's major river systems have caught fire repeatedly, disrupting the very backbone of how fuel gets distributed across such an enormous country, a network built over decades that is now being systematically dismantled piece by piece. At the peak of this campaign, Russia's total oil refining capacity reportedly dropped by more than 40%. Daily processing volume fell to its lowest point in over 2 decades. That's not a small dip. That's a structural collapse in one of the most important industries keeping the country running, an industry that funds a huge share of the national budget and props up the entire war effort. And the damage isn't limited to civilian fuel either. Military-grade diesel used by mechanized units on the front line has also been affected, meaning this crisis reaches directly into Russia's own war effort, weakening the very forces it depends on to continue fighting. The response from Russian authorities has been to impose strict fuel rationing across dozens of regions, limiting how much any single vehicle can purchase and banning the use of jerry cans entirely in many areas. When a government has to legally restrict how much gasoline a citizen can buy in their own country, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a full-blown national emergency being managed in real time, with officials scrambling to prevent the situation from spiraling completely out of control. And here's the part that makes this even harder for Russia to fix quickly. Repairing this kind of damage isn't simple. Modern refineries depend on highly specialized equipment, much of which came from Western manufacturers, who have now pulled out of the Russian market entirely because of sanctions. Without access to proper replacement parts or specialized repair technology, Russian engineers have reportedly resorted to cannibalizing older, non-functional refinery units, stripping usable parts from one broken facility to patch up another. It's a temporary fix at best, and one that experts warn creates long-term structural risks, since these makeshift repairs put enormous stress on aging equipment that wasn't designed to be pieced together this way, leaving facilities vulnerable to sudden failures even without another drone strike. Energy analysts don't expect this problem to resolve itself anytime soon either. Projections suggest Russia's overall oil production could decline further before the year is out, with the refining sector facing what many now consider a semi-permanent structural weakness rather than a temporary setback that will fade with time. The financial toll has already been enormous, with billions of dollars in losses piling up in the refining sector alone since last year. That's money the Kremlin desperately needs elsewhere, particularly to keep funding its military operations, and every dollar lost to this crisis makes that balancing act even harder to sustain. This financial strain creates a brutal ripple effect across the entire economy. Rising fuel and transport costs push up prices on nearly everything else, from groceries to construction materials, feeding directly into broader inflation that Russia's central bank has been struggling to control for months now. Officials find themselves stuck in an impossible position, needing to raise interest rates to fight inflation, while simultaneously worrying that doing so could push already fuel-starved businesses toward bankruptcy, a genuine lose-lose scenario with no clean way out. Faced with a shortage this severe, the Russian government has taken increasingly drastic measures. For the first time in the country's history, authorities issued a complete ban on jet fuel exports, a move aimed at preserving enough fuel to keep both civilian and military aircraft operating without interruption. Gasoline export restrictions, already in place for months, were extended further, and officials have reportedly discussed halting diesel exports entirely as well. For a nation that has built its global reputation and economic power around being a major energy exporter, banning its own exports just to meet domestic demand is an extraordinary admission of how deep this crisis actually runs beneath the surface. And the ripple effects extend well beyond Russia's own borders, too. Countries in Asia and Africa that depended on steady, affordable fuel shipments from Russia have had to scramble for alternative suppliers after Moscow abruptly restricted its exports, disrupting relationships that took years to build. In an almost ironic twist, Russia has reportedly had to start importing refined gasoline itself, including shipments arriving by sea from refineries in India, paying significantly more for processed fuel than it would normally earn selling its own raw crude oil. For a country that built decades of global influence around energy exports, becoming an emergency fuel importer is a stunning reversal that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. Quiet negotiations have also reportedly taken place with neighboring countries like Kazakhstan and Belarus, seeking emergency fuel shipments to help ease the shortage. But even close allies have reportedly approached these requests cautiously, wary of straining their own domestic fuel supplies to bail out Moscow. When even your closest partners hesitate to help, it says something about how strained those relationships have become, and how isolated Russia is starting to feel, even among nations it once considered dependable allies. In an effort to stretch what fuel remains, authorities have also reportedly lowered official fuel quality standards, allowing lower-grade gasoline to be sold at stations across the country. While this helps stretch limited supplies further, it comes with a real cost. Lower quality fuel can cause serious mechanical damage, particularly in modern vehicles, many of which were imported in recent years from China or through indirect channels from Western manufacturers. As a result, mechanics across the country are reportedly seeing a rising wave of engine problems, adding yet another layer of frustration for ordinary drivers who are already struggling just to find fuel in the first place, only to watch it damage the very car they waited hours to fill. If this story is putting the scale of Russia's crisis into perspective for you, take a second and hit subscribe with notifications turned on. Stories like this move fast, and you don't want to miss the next update. The disruption hasn't stopped at fuel infrastructure either. Major logistics and distribution hubs have also come under direct attack. One of the most striking recent examples involved a massive distribution center belonging to one of Russia's largest e-commerce companies, struck by drones just outside Moscow. The resulting damage reportedly ran into the billions of dollars, destroying not just consumer goods, but also equipment believed to be tied to military supply chains routed through commercial logistics networks. Striking a facility like that accomplishes two things at once. It disrupts everyday commercial life for millions of ordinary shoppers, and it quietly chips away at supply routes feeding military equipment to the front lines, blending civilian and military consequences into a single devastating blow. That same night, a massive fuel storage facility supplying the greater Moscow area also went up in flames, with black smoke visible for days afterward across the capital's skyline. For a capital city that has largely remained insulated from the direct physical consequences of the war, watching your own regional fuel supply burn on live footage sends an unmistakable message. The war has arrived at the doorstep of power itself, no longer something happening safely far away. Even Russia's much-publicized air defense systems, layered specifically to protect Moscow and its surrounding region, have reportedly struggled to keep pace with the sheer volume of drone attacks. Officials have acknowledged that nearly 2,000 drones targeted the capital region in a single week alone, an overwhelming number that has stretched radar systems, interceptor missiles, and defensive coordination to their absolute limits. When a defense network built specifically to protect the seat of government starts showing visible strain, it raises uncomfortable questions about how secure that government actually is and how long that vulnerability can be hidden from a public that is watching more closely every single day. What we're witnessing here isn't just an isolated energy problem. It's a slow-motion unraveling of an unspoken agreement that has existed between the Russian state and its citizens for years. Stay out of politics, avoid confrontation with the government, and in exchange, enjoy a relatively stable and predictable daily life. That agreement depended entirely on ordinary people, not feeling the direct cost of decisions made in the Kremlin. That protective distance is gone now. Empty gas tanks, brutal wait times, and street-level violence have brought the consequences of those decisions directly into people's daily lives. And no amount of state media messaging can fully paper over lived experience when the evidence is sitting right outside your front door, as this crisis stretches from small provincial towns all the way into the suburbs of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The psychological impact matters just as much as the economic one. For years, the myth of stability and control helped keep public dissatisfaction contained, even during difficult periods. That myth becomes much harder to maintain when citizens are filming themselves waiting 36 hours in a fuel line or watching neighbors throw punches over who gets to the pump first, and then sharing that footage with millions of others across the country. Looking ahead, Russian leadership faces an incredibly difficult set of choices with no easy answers available. Protecting refineries and fuel infrastructure more aggressively could mean pulling air defense resources away from the front lines, weakening the military effort at a critical moment. Prioritizing the war effort instead risks even deeper damage to an already fragile civilian economy, deepening public anger in the process. There simply isn't a clean solution available, and every option carries serious risk, whether that risk shows up on the battlefield or in the streets back home. With winter approaching, a season that has historically tested Russian resilience in ways few other challenges can, the pressure on ordinary citizens is only likely to intensify. Heating fuel, transportation, food distribution, all of these systems depend on the same fragile energy infrastructure currently under sustained attack. If the current trajectory continues, this coming season could become one of the most difficult economic stretches Russia has faced in decades. testing not just the government's ability to manage a crisis, but the patience of a population that is visibly running out of it. So here's where that leaves us. A nation built on energy wealth, now rationing its own citizens' access to fuel. A government that spent years insulating its people from the direct costs of war, now watching that insulation collapse in real time on camera phones and social media feeds across the country. What we're witnessing on Russian streets right now isn't just a supply chain problem. It's a warning sign, a visible crack in a system that depended on stability to survive. Whether that crack widens into something bigger, or whether the Kremlin manages to patch it back together one more A-time, may end up shaping the next chapter of this war far more than anything happening on the battlefield itself. Because when people start fighting each other just to fill a gas tank, that's not a distant political story anymore. That's a society under real strain, and history tells us those moments rarely stay contained for long.